papers in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics that harshly criticize Besant's and 8 related papers that depend on an IAD model by arguing how the observed WTC destruction is very much three-dimensional. Please comment. Sorry? 1D. Okay, 1D. Sorry.
Well, I'm not. Is this on?
Okay.
Is this on? I'm not quite entirely sure what the question is. However, one thing about Besant's model and what I followed in responding to Besant, like just treating the blocks as solid blocks. In fact, the towers are collections of vertical columns and then cross members and so forth. So it had a lot of structure to it. One of the questions I had in terms of this issue is if you basically have a bunch of the columns basically being like mostly air and tubes and all that, and then you have all these spears of steel aiming at each other, like what would happen if they just spear past each other? And like, you know, there's no impact or very little impact at that point, right? And I had one of the people who unfortunately is not here. He should add to the conversation, but Tony Zambodi and I had a interesting conversation about this, and he was describing the columns as being, you know, they're very heavily cross-braced. And so if you have these columns spearing past each other, what's going to be happening is you're going to be tearing up the cross-bracing of both sections, the falling section and the lower section. So by the time the top section had penetrated down its own size into the rest of the building, the cross-bracing's gone and you have loose material. And so at that point you basically don't have any pile driver left. And so even if you describe it in a more probably accurate way than the idea of crushing blocks, you would still have the mutual destruction of both sections at an equal rate. And given that the top section is so small, that's going to go first. So that's basically I don't know if it addressed the actual question, but that's what I had to say about it.
Okay, thank you. For Kevin Ryan and John Cole, many people and publications, apparently, have questioned the original construction of WTC 1 and 2, stating the possibility of lax standards or cost-cutting that would have made it easier to collapse due to substandard methods. Your response?
My response would be that the Twin Towers were built to all the applicable codes at the time. I believe even when NIST looked into this, there was no fault back on the original designers of the Twin Towers. So I don't think there was any building codes violated. And in fact, I think back then, before all this computer analysis where we can really hone things down from a structural aspect to get it to be more and more efficient, typically some of the older buildings actually were more robust than some of the newer buildings out there. Again, that's my opinion, but I don't think there was any fault as far as the construction whatsoever. Kevin?
Is that mic on?
You have to hold it very close to, very close.
Yeah, this is Kevin. All I can say to that, that might help, is that the people who built the World Trade Center towers were given multiple awards for the engineering and construction, so that they were recognized at the time as being, if I got the quote correctly, the greatest contribution to engineering and mankind at the time. And of course they stood with no problems whatsoever, no indication of any structural issues prior to 9/11. I think that's about as much as I can say on that.
Okay, thank you. How can one keep thermate, an unstable compound, stable until the time of use, and for how long?
In the garage. Neil said, I'm going to give the practical answer since I still have some kicking around. I had a very difficult time igniting it, and I point that out in one of my videos. For me to ignite thermate, it wasn't an easy thing. It wasn't like storing 5 gallons of gasoline where you're worried about somebody dropping a cigarette and lighting it. It was more that I had to use magnesium strips and use something very, very hot to get that thermate to burn. So from a personal standpoint, I didn't see a problem as far as stability or a concern as far as it spontaneously going off. But the chemist, I'm sure, can reinforce my personal experience with it.
That's true. Also, the thermites I made as a student, you really need to kick it hard. Really, I can tell you what we started a mixture of barium peroxide and potassium chlorate. This is the real stuff. And just to kick the thermite reaction is very difficult. Nanothermite is different because there's an organic material in there. But I can certainly support the experience by Jonathan Cole.
Thank you. How many compromised NIST scientists do you suspect were required to draft the NIST report?
I believe that's a little misleading. Frankly, I believe that the government scientists that worked for NIST, most of them did honest work. They tried to do the right, produce the right results. They didn't fudge the results. And the real problem is that the report then was written by contradicting or ignoring the results that they produced. So then the answer to your question is that the few people who edited the report and approved the final report, revised the conclusions as necessary, those are the people that we would have to look to as far as being problems.
For Graham McQueen, otherwise this person mentions wonderful talk, but asks, why did you choose to not mention the statements of Dan Rather and Peter Jennings on network TV?
Time.
Okay.
I didn't have enough time to deal with all the excellent evidence. There are many, many statements. Actually, John Cole showed some,
Yes.
and Richard Gage showed some yesterday.
Yes.
There are so many people on 9/11 making reference to explosions and controlled demolition and so on that in 45 minutes you just can't cover it.
Okay, thank you. Some online questions to any of you in particular. Would the trial of KSM allow any of this evidence to come to light? It's all they are asking. There's no qualification on that.
Well, I don't believe that the trial of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed would shine too much light on the destruction of the World Trade Center buildings. Apart from the fact that the man was waterboarded 183 times, I have a feeling that most of the people in this room would admit to pretty much anything after the 103rd time, or perhaps earlier. And I personally do not believe that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had anything to do with the destruction of the World Trade Center.
Okay. For David Chandler, how can a single column failure cause an 8-story free fall collapse? Or perhaps the question could be restated. Is there any scenario you can imagine where a single column failure could cause an 8-story free fall collapse?
I think it's pretty bizarre, which is it's one of the things that makes the report seem very artificial. But in order to get a collapse, like if just experience with collapses of other kinds of buildings, you have something fall and that might weaken something and it can propagate, but as Sham Sundar himself said, there'd be a whole sequence of things that would have to take place, and it's not going to all happen instantaneously, so it's going to be a progression. And so it's going to occupy time, and it's not going to just knock out all the supports simultaneously. So to get free fall out of that, hey, NIST wasn't able to get free fall out of that, so they had to wave their hands and stuff. So I
Okay.
don't see that works.
Gotcha. For the panel, let's see, for the panel, will Pano's information packets, written background materials be included in the final report? Yes. Yes. For John Cole, wouldn't the towers have looked like massive, bright, white torches while coming down?
Well, they didn't look like bright white torches when they were coming down, but there were reports of bright white flashes. As a matter of fact, even in the NIST reports, and I have it in my briefcase, but in addition to mentioning the pressure pulses and the dust puffs, they also referenced several white flashes that were going on. So there were reports of white flashes. The magnitude and how much material was needed for those white flashes, I don't know, but I don't think the whole thing would necessarily have to be a white flash.
Keep the microphone. Did you test the Swiss cheese-like metal in your examinations for presence of sulfur?
Good question. No, I did not. No, I did not. I did use sulfur in the thermate, and I showed how I made the thermate, but I did not independently test that piece of steel, which I still have.
And this question comes up to anyone. It may be sort of more or less explained. What about reports of major renovations done on both towers before 9/11? Major renovations.
Major renovations include modifications of the office areas, and there are references to that in the NIST report. I can't say they're comprehensive, but the NIST report does include reference to major renovations, which floors they were performed on, and which tenants therefore were impacted. It's interesting to note that the agreement with tenants was that the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey would be responsible for modifications to the core areas of the towers. And largely, the floors apart from that, if there was an active leaseholder, they would be largely responsible for modifications within the occupied areas. Not entirely, but largely.
John Cole, could water used to put out fires cause sulfur in gypsum to attack steel?
I'm not sure. I'm not a chemist. However, I did apply water to the gypsum on one side of my my tests that I did. One side was dry. The other side I did soak in water. I doubt it. Maybe I can ask the chemist that, but I don't know if that could, if adding water to an existing hot fire with burning wallboard could take the calcium sulfate and turn it into element sulfur. I don't know the answer to that.
John Cole, also, about approximately how many people with similar background as yourself are there in 9/11 groups that you're familiar with, or AE 9/11 Truth? About how many of your background?
I'm not sure, but again, as Richard Gage mentioned, I think there's 1,550 registered architects and/or professional engineers. I don't know how many. Excuse me. I don't know how many are civil engineers in that group. But you can go online and you can actually see what the specialty is for each one there.
Kevin Ryan, does thermite account for molten metal in basement for over periods of months, or for buildings turning to dust? That seems more or less answered.
Yeah, I think that thermite is an explanation for molten metal, not only pouring from the buildings, but also in the debris pile. And then for pulverized dust, I think that the experiments that were shown today at the hearings demonstrate that there is the power to pulverize materials.
Niels Harriet, why didn't you test the thermitic activity of the chips in a vacuum?
Because the only known differential scanning calorimeter done on nanothermite was done in air. We actually called Tillotson, is the author of this measurement, and we asked him specifically, did you run it in air, or did you? And it was run in air. So for comparison, we did the same thing. Another thing is that the World Trade Center was not demolished under argon. So.
Okay. What is the estimated, for Niels Harriet, what is the estimated, if it exists, or what would you estimate to be the volume of thermitic paint needed to create total destruction of the buildings?
Wow, that is a huge one, because I I can't say. But it is a lot. And if you can make a calculation based on the amount of nanospheres found in the RJLE group, and it points to a huge quantity. As I have, we should not go into numbers, but I would say it implies that the red grade chips alone cannot account for the formation of all the iron spheres. There is no doubt that there was more than one thermitic process going on. It's implied in the numbers, in the quantitative numbers, the quantities found by the RJLE group. That's all I can say for sure.
Okay.
It's a lot.
Okay. This, again, we're going to questions that are from our audience gathered. The International Center for 9/11 Studies and Judy Wood's movement disagree on the mechanism of the destruction on 9/11, but agree that the official story violates the elementary laws of physics. Can't they, that is, these particular groups, find a way to at least work together on mobilizing support for a legitimate investigation?
Judy Wood? Judy Wood? Yeah. The answer for my personally is no. She's talking about directed energy weapons, and let maybe a few comments on that. Energy is not a thing. It is a concept you use in calculations. And so when you're talking about weapons, you have to talk about things. If somebody is hitting another person with his fist, this is an energy-directed weapon. The only weapons not being energy-directed are biological weapons. So we have to ask Judy Wood exactly what is the directed energy weapon she's talking about, because we haven't heard of. So before any cooperation with Ms. Judy Wood, please tell us what you're talking about.
Okay. Dr. Harriet, could nanothermites have just been painted on skeletal structure of WTCs?
Well, I don't know what the questioner means by just.
Yes, good point.
Because it could be, yes.
Okay. Has anyone held a radiation monitor against the dust in that you have with this custodial record? Geiger, whatever.
A Geiger counter. I haven't read this paper thoroughly, but there is some indication of a minute heightened level of tritium in the water under ground zero. Very minute. I haven't read the paper probably, but it's just at the noise level. Have you read about it?
Yeah, actually, Professor Stephen Jones has wrote a paper a number of years ago spelling out the dozen or so evidentiary points that that show that a nuclear device was not present at the World Trade Center. There's quite a few of these. I can't remember them all. I've forwarded them to people who continue to ask about it. But yes, a very small level of tritium present, which is really arguably explanatory just with regard to variation in the atmosphere. So other than that, nothing that you would think would be radioactive fallout sort of material at all. And as far as we know, there are no nuclear devices that don't produce radioactive fallout.
Okay. From FOIA released files, I, the questioner, received a heavily redacted FE model. My firm studied it and found NIST used 1/1000th actual densities. Can you imagine why?
The reference here is to finite element analysis, and the claim being made in the question is of a discovery through the study of Freedom of Information released files that the NIST was, I suppose the word would be fudging, material densities by a very major factor.
I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Question for Jonathan Cole. From your presentation, it appears that the real perpetrators may have planted the thermitic material during the fireproofing upgrade to support the future official cover theory of weakening of the steel and sagging, whereas the explosives were used to actually bring down the building. Comment?
That's Jonathan Cole's speculation. That is one of my speculations, that it could have been, as Niels had mentioned earlier, could it have been in the paint, could it have been sprayed on. One of my speculations combining that along with the upgrades that were made to the fireproofing. And I believe this can be checked out, but I believe the fireproofing was put on heavier or thicker than the specs called for. That's it has to be checked out, which is unusual when you hire a contractor to put on more than you're paying for. But it's a speculation that perhaps it was done during that time. But generally, yes, correct.
Why would whoever planted the, this is not to anyone in particular, why would whoever planted the incendiaries and explosives in WTC 7 have only done so such that just the top 8 floors fell in free fall and not all of the floors? And why did they not also pre-rig WTC 6 and other complex other WTC buildings expected to be damaged by falling debris by controlled demolition charges? Question.
I want to talk about the first part. That's a major misconception based on what I said. Any reference to 8 floors is just sort of a illustrative, for the public, kind of an illustration of how much height we're talking about. It wasn't just the top 8 floors that fell. It was the entire top section of the building, all of the visible section of the building, which went a lot lower than you could see. But the entire visible part of the building was dropping, and it dropped for about 2.5 seconds. NIST's measurement was 2.25 seconds. But still, in either case, NIST and I agreed that it was over 100 feet of drop. It's the drop of the whole basic, most of the building. And the 8 floors business is just like saying, when we talk about a football field, that's an illustration of what 100 meters or 100 feet, 100 yards rather, is talking about. So it's not like it's the top 8 floors that fell.
Okay. Any new research that we should be looking forward to? I take it addressed to all of the panelists, the witnesses, that you wish to comment? New research forthcoming? You've mentioned some, of course, in your presentations, but...
Well, yeah. Maybe I should take this opportunity to stress that the results I presented on the nanotubes are preliminary. The pictures I showed was taken last Friday. And so maybe it's a little premature. Actually, it doesn't count before it's published. But if this had been what I called an ordinary scientific conference, everybody would have loved to see preliminary results. We love them. The hotter, the better. But still, please notice that these are preliminary, and what I have to do is to confirm them, but I believe them.
After 3 days of hearings, if I were an American, I would be very angry that my government thought that Americans are stupid. Do you agree, any of the panelists?
Being a teacher, sometimes you wander around the campus and say, oh my God, are these the people that are going to be running this country? But anyway, that's just, okay. No, there is definitely a thread that runs through American culture that's very anti-intellectual. And as a physics and math teacher, the physics and the upper end of the math, you're getting cream of the crop students, but that's a thinned out number. And the bulk of the students frequently are not getting what I would consider to be an adequate science and math education. And so I think but the other thing is, culturally, look at all the forces in culture that are appealing to other elements of your personality than your brain, And you look at TV and they dumb down the news, they dumb down everything. And so it's not a very intellectually stimulating environment. And so my number one recommendation, all of you, turn off your TVs.
And I think there's another element here. I'm not so sure Americans are really that stupid. I do think Americans are misinformed and uninformed. I mean, I myself, I'm an engineer. I didn't see this for years because I wasn't aware of it. So if they control so much of the information that you receive, I mean, it sounds outrageous. Let's face it. When you first hear this thing, you're in shock. It's like, there's no way. And then when you learn the evidence, the official story is the one that seems outrageous. So I think it's not so much of a dumbing down necessarily. There's a lot of intelligent people, obviously, in America. I think it's more of a misinformation and how much control, how much propaganda, if you will, American propaganda there really is out there, which is hard for the average American to swallow. But I think that may be a big part of it also.
I also sometimes find myself really indignant. I guess I've always gotten indignant when I think someone is taking me for a fool. And this would be one of several motivations that keeps me at that. I think the people who did this do at some level think we're all stupid, that we couldn't see through it. And that offends me. I also think, though, that ultimately there's more than stupidity going on. And it's certainly not just the American population that has this problem. There's a widespread tendency of people to accept what authorities tell them. And I'm told all the time when I give interviews, I just can't believe that the government would do that. You know, any government would do that. I just can't believe it. It's implausible. And of course, there's a whole set of worldviews at issue here. And it really doesn't have a lot to do with intelligence. There's something else going on. You have to be willing to take a big step to realize that Father, who is supposed to be taking care of you, may not really be taking care of you at all.
Yeah. The truth hurts, but the lies kill us.
Final question. How appropriate, how poetic. Who has the authority to arrest the President of the United States?
There's somebody out there that has the answer to that. Where are you?
It is becoming clear this is a case of high treason. What is the next step to see justice served? Stay tuned. Whoops, I didn't mean to say it again.
Professor Harrod and I would like to suggest that you do make time to be here tomorrow for some ideas from Senator Gravel.
Okay. Well, with that, then we announcements. Okay.
Hi, I'm Lori. I'm one of the steering committee members, and I have a very brief but very important announcement to make. First, on behalf of the steering committee, I'd like to express our deep gratitude and appreciation for the very dignified manner in which all of our attendees have conducted themselves. We wish to maintain this integrity throughout the rest of the proceedings, through until our final and most important day, when our panelists will be addressing us. It has come to our attention that there is an individual with a video camera outside at the back entrance that has been harassing some of our guests. Ryerson Security has kindly asked this individual to exit their property, and he has moved out onto the street. Because we wish to maintain the integrity of this event, we ask you please do not engage with this individual at this time. Ryerson has also asked that you remove your ID badges and exit through the front doors so that we can stay on a successful note and end this without any trouble. And the steering committee endorses this idea, and we would appreciate your cooperation to help make this event a real success. And on a little bit of a personal note, I will be speaking tomorrow on the psychological resistance to alternative accounts. And I really hope to convince you why it is so important to maintain the perception of integrity, dignity, respectability, in order for people to take us seriously. Okay? So please.
Thank you, Laurie. This is perhaps one moment at which we could, at least in a preliminary way, just mention with gratitude the enormous labor that volunteers and members of the organizing committee have been steadily putting into the work involved in preparing this event and sustaining us through the various glitches and occasional little errors that at least one of your moderators has made on occasion, I confess. I've looked on at this work with admiration and enormous gratitude. Now, we're bringing today's sessions to a close. We have had, I think, a really extraordinary body of evidence put forward to us today. And perhaps one of the threads that runs through this evidence, at least perhaps in retrospect, after hearing this very powerful body of material, is that there has to be a clear understanding of the difference between physical evidence and speculations regarding human contingencies. You know, the questions that arise as to if such and such happened, how could it have happened, what would the logistics have been, and so on. Those are all interesting questions, and they're worth addressing and investigating. But they're not questions on the same level, either in a methodological sense or a scientific sense, as the questions we have been hearing addressed in I think a very rigorous and critical sense, both addressed both by our witnesses and by the members of our panel, whose critical persistence and acuity we are most grateful for. So we look forward to seeing all of you again tomorrow morning for another successful day. Thank you.